Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. We hope you're enjoying your summer. Please enjoy this conversation with Matt Kaminski, co-founder of Politico Europe, about the European media ecosystem and why Politico Europe was created in the first place. We'd like to remind you that we'll also be doing a mailbag episode in September, and that we would love to hear from you. If you have feedback or any questions for Donatien and me, please send them to us at erep@csis.org. That's erep@csis.org. Details can be found in the episode description. Enjoy the interview. We are thrilled to welcome Matthew Kaminski to the Eurofile. Matt is a co-founder and was editor-in-chief of Politico Europe, and he was also the editor-in-chief of Politico here in the US. He joined Politico in 2014 and quickly launched the European edition, which has since become one of the, quote, most influential publications in the world on European affairs. And Matt has reported on international affairs, politics, and business around Europe and the US for the past quarter century. He's one of the most notable journalists here in Washington. Matt, thanks so much for joining the Eurofile.
Great to be here, Max.
So you had spent time in Europe as a journalist, the Wall Street Journal in the 1990s, and then came back to Brussels in the mid-teens to launch Politico EU. Maybe you could talk a little bit about why did you think that Politico.eu was a good idea? And how did Brussels sort of change from when you were there in the 90s to the mid-teens?
You know, the European story is never done. And even in my 30 years, I guess, of covering it from just after the end of the Berlin Wall to today, I think we've gone through several different eras. And I was lucky enough to be there in the 90s when I thought Europe had a real vision, had a real dream that it was trying to realize of, a continent whole and free. Paradoxically, it was the British who were pushing this, enlargement toward Eastern Europe to bring in the Central European states back into the European family. It was a very optimistic period. But then being in Brussels, I always felt it was undercovered and Europe was covered badly and it was never covered enough.
Did you think it was undercovered by the US or by European press or both?
I would say both. I think, the European press certainly covered it from the point of view of their national interest. So Brussels actually had a bigger press corps and has more embassies than Washington. You wouldn't think that. There's more diplomats and journalists in Brussels, but they were very much focused on, if you're for the Italian media, you're like, what does it mean for Italy that Brussels has done this? But no one really kind of grappled seriously with the European Union as an institution, as an idea, and no one really treated Brussels as a political center. For Americans, for a long time, and to this day in some sense, but that's also changed, it was a curiosity. No major American news outlet, certainly not the Washington Post, the New York Times, had a bureau in Brussels until the last 10 years. So in the 1990s, the Wall Street Journal, where I was, their headquarters happened to be in Brussels, but even selling those stories to my foreign editor in New York was very hard. So when the opportunity came up in 2014 to do a publication around Europe, the first thing that I heard was, who needs this? Who wants this? It's surely going to fail. Others have tried. Robert Maxwell famously tried with the European. The Journal tried with its own European edition that's since been kind of really scaled back, and the Brussels headquarters is no longer an HQ for them. But then people just thought, it's kind of boring. And this is where I disagreed. And this is where I felt, having grown up in Washington, I was like, this city kind of makes sense to me, Brussels. Less sun, less humidity too, better restaurants. But it was a very political town, a one-company town. And even if the politics were a little bit abstruse, it was taking decisions that mattered for 400 million Europeans. It had real power around trade policy, which this week it seems to have given up. But that's something we can probably get into. Had real power around competition policy, could decide if companies merge. And it was a real regulatory force. Coming back, we just thought that you could bring American-style political journalism to Brussels and it could work. It could bring the town to life in a way that very few journalists were even trying to do in Brussels at the time.
Maybe walk me through the TikTok here a little bit, because it strikes me as a very hard sell, as you mentioned, of like, let's cover these technocratic Brussels institutions. Was this sort of your idea, initiative, or why was this launched? Because it strikes me as sort of a bold stroke from Politico now roughly 10 years ago.
I mean, this goes back quite a ways now. I mean, 10 years is a long time, obviously. But at the time, Robert Albritton, who was the first owner of Politico, I think early on had an intuition that I think this can work in Brussels. Brussels seems to me like Washington in Europe. You have lobbyists, you have lawyers, you got a bunch of media. There's clearly some journalism to be done there. And there's also, as importantly, money to be made there out of that journalism. And at the same time, you had Axel Springer and their CEO, Matthias Döpfner. And Matthias, as a young journalist, had been based in Brussels. He had, by that point, really transformed Axel Springer from a kind of old school, print newspaper media company into a digital first company. And they were very keen to learn about new digital media that was primarily coming out of the US. But they also thought that you could do something interesting at the European level, that Europe was trying to create a European political union, a monetary union, which did exist by that time, an economic union, but it had no European media. This was an attempt, okay, we can do this not with an old newspaper strategy, but with a kind of digital media that was doing very well in the US. Let's try and bring that brand to Europe, adapt the approach to Europe, obviously, but they thought that they could do it. And this is why they formed a joint venture in 2014, which I had known Matthias, I'd known a little bit about Robert here. And I was like, this is really gelled for me in that, I think Brussels was undercovered and was covered badly. There's an opening here. Someone's got to grab it. Why isn't it this initiative? They approached me at some point that year and said, hey, would you want to set this up for us and run it for us? And it was, the most fun I've had in my professional life.
Yeah, I remember here in Washington when Politico launched and first seeing...
Very out of character. I mean, it was just like inside the Beltway, navel gazing. And, none of the founders in Washington have sort of never worked outside of Washington and covered American politics. And I think it took some convincing. Also, this is why the thinking was Politico could not do it on its own, and it could not grow it out of Washington. It had to kind of plant something there with people who had, local experience. And our primary goal from the beginning was we will not succeed unless this is seen as native to its terrain. And this is where Axel Springer's involvement was so important because, it's a big European media company is on board here. This is really a European venture as much as an American one. And then when we said about hiring people, we're like, we're going to hire Europeans. This cannot be an American venture, can't even be a British one because Britain then, the phrase Brexit was already in the air. So when we launched, I think we launched about 30 journalists. We had, 20 different languages, 14 different passports. The majority of the staff was non-native English speaking. So we were trying to create something that felt local.
And the breakout of Politico here in Washington was sort of its faster, gossipy style that was a little bit more hard-hitting, covered the town sort of slightly differently than the Washington Post or other papers in kind of a slightly more staid way. It was a little bit more horse race politics. Did you apply this sort of the same approach in Brussels, or would you agree with that characterization? And what was sort of the reaction when you all launched? Did the antibodies strike back against Politico when it first launched in Brussels?
I probably disagree a little bit with the characterization only in the sense that I think any media that's trying to stand out, first of all, has to have a very clear idea of who its readers should be or your audience is and what their habits are. And when Politico launched in 2007, it was the BlackBerry era.
The kids don't know what that is.
BlackBerry is like a sort of iPhone, but was sort of clunkier and had a keyboard.
It was a sign of status, too. If you didn't have a BlackBerry, you were...
Yeah, and you wore these kind of holsters, remember? You had these holsters, and you had them here, and you walked around with the BlackBerry.
It was very Washington.
Yeah. It's not so brilliant in retrospect, but at the time, it's like, why can't we just deliver the news as it is happening? Because people don't want to wait for the next day's print newspaper to be dropped on their front door to know what happened. And that was not the most brilliant insight, but at the time, most people at the Washington Post and New York Times were filing to a newspaper deadline of 6 p.m. and going home, getting a martini, getting a read back of their stories and going to sleep and repeat. And I think Politico kind of initiated something that was long overdue, that journalism is live, it's happening now, your audiences want it now. When we launched in Europe, our feeling was a little different. It was that, yes, we would be digital first. It would be built around newsletters, around delivering it in people's inboxes, grabbing people off the street in Brussels, dragging them into our events. Part of it was like obviously speeding up distribution. I think we did take a little bit of that There used to be a saying that most of the DNA is New York Times, Washington Post DNA. Then you have some trade press DNA, which is this very wonky. It's sort of, it's obsessed with things that most people find boring, but you're people who consume this stuff here to find it super interesting. And then there's a strain of tabloid. Let's not be too self-serious. The people in this world think the world is kind of exciting. They want to hear dirt or good things about their colleagues or competitors.
Who's up, who's down.
And then politics is it's a full contact sport. I use sports metaphors all the time. We're covering a game. That then became, politics has become too serious and the threat to our republic and democracy. But I think that applies still because it understands what people respond well to in terms of journalism. The thing that we tried to do in Brussels was, when I came in, I spent enough time there, 6 years as a reporter, consuming all of their jargon-filled press releases, reports, and everyone just became comfortable with that's the language we all speak. And even though 450 Europeans have no idea what we're talking about, we're going to make this boring, and it's boring on purpose. And the Commission actually made things boring on purpose. They didn't want people to know exactly the details of the fisheries policies or exactly where these billions of euros were going. And I said immediately, we will not be captive to this system, and certainly not this kind of cant, this language. We're going to speak in simple terms about what we see. And again, I came from almost 20 years at the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal. These were not tabloids. I wish I had a tabloid experience, but I came from very serious legacy newspapers. This is a chance to kind of be a little bit more of a pirate, have a little bit more fun, set out to create characters in the city. Like if you were putting on a soap opera, who would be the characters? This is really old history, so stop me if this is kind of boring. But Jean-Claude Juncker, the former Prime Minister of Luxembourg, he was famously a lush, liked his drink before lunch. He had this kind of evil mastermind named Martin Selmayr, who's his German chief of staff. There was another German at the parliament. So we tried to create sort of characters and dramas out of it. And that people were just shocked by, because no one was used to European bureaucrats being written about, as they should have been the whole time, as really powerful politicians who were admirable, flawed, or whatever, but had real power and should have been covered the way we cover Chuck Schumer and Donald Trump here. And the other thing, we just said, we're not going to be polite. Brussels had gotten so used to, everyone is sort of, we're all in the club. You get to have a nice tax-free salary here. You get to take long vacations and nice dinners. And I remember the first issue, we had a piece about Margrethe Vestager, who was the competition commissioner, who was then going after Google with the first of several huge antitrust cases. And the headline on the piece was, "The Goblin Under Google's Bed." And at our launch event, I was cornered by one of these, old Brussels types, like, "I cannot believe you called the commissioner a goblin." I was like, oh, this is going to work, and I think initially, it's too gossipy, it's too sensationalist. I knew it was going to work because people actually responded very well to that. And most people in that town are actually not boring bureaucrats. They tend to be pretty cosmopolitan people, well-educated, well-traveled, and they needed a media. And within a couple of weeks, we had someone named Ryan Heath doing our playbook. He became the most important journalist in town. And people started saying, we can't even imagine a time before you were here. And that was only a few weeks in. It was like the space was wide open for us. Whereas in Washington, it's super crowded, and it had been for decades. But in Brussels, it was really wide open. And
what was it like for your reporters and for you in getting stories? And, because I could see, don't talk to Politico because, they called our commissioner a goblin. You see that here in Washington where there'll be, press bans. We're not talking to Fox News. What was it like trying to get scoops and stories in Brussels?
So in Brussels, you had the Financial Times, which had the monopoly virtually on coverage of the city. When I was there in the 90s, we were so frustrated, even at the Wall Street Journal, not an unknown place, that we knew that the Financial Times bureau chief at the time was Lionel Barber, became later the editor. We knew, or we thought we knew, that half his scoops were just like officials faxing him documents at 4 p.m. in the afternoon that he just wrote up because they wanted it out there for whatever reason. And the FT had, and I think stayed in some ways, the place, because they were fairly polite to the European Commission, stayed the more favored outlet, whereas we were the ones that you were a little bit afraid of. And I think it cultivated a good sense of the underdog complex in reporters. We had a really great mix at the very beginning. I remember we hired someone as a great reporter at the New York Post, Tara Palmieri, who has since come back here and done some great work at various publications in Washington. And she just hit the town, and the town didn't know what hit it, because they'd never seen a kind of a sort of brass-knuckled, New York metro reporter who's just been through a lot, is savvy, but is going to get the stories. And she just started breaking story after story. There's these European summits. They used to be much more important than they are now, as I think Brussels, I would argue, has kind of shrunk down in its relative importance, at least in political terms, not in regulatory terms. We used to break stories from inside the meetings as they were going on. By then, the iPhone was sort of the thing that people were using, that leaders like reading our stories inside the meetings on their iPhone, telling them what is being discussed in the meeting that they're in. And I think that really just kind of shook things up. And again, the place was ready for it, and it was well overdue.
You were there, or started, it seemed like at a really opportune time, at least from a journalist perspective, where Brussels and the European project seemed on the cusp of collapse. You had the Euro crisis, you had migration crisis in 2015, Brexit in 2016. What was that environment like? And did that really help elevate the coverage of Politico across Europe?
Well, I found a city that was in a severe kind of depressive spiral. I think by time in 2015, and again, there's reasons to be down on Europe now, but the causes are quite different. At the time, you had the Greek crisis, so the Greek debt crisis, which threatened the future of the euro. Greece might leave the euro. That was never conceived of when the euro was created in the late 90s, as someone gets out of the monetary union. You had the beginnings of the migration crisis. I think the week we launched, there were about 900 people who died when a boat sank in the Mediterranean. Actually, for our launch party, we had a bunch of cancellations from top leaders because they were at an emergency summit that evening to discuss the fallout from this. You forget there was also ISIS. You had the blowback into Europe from what was happening in Syria. That was the kind of second surge of terrorism in Europe. You had many terrorist sort of chapters in Europe over the last, 50 years, but you had the post 9/11 period, and then you had ISIS cells coming back to Europe. There's an attack in Brussels, outside of Brussels, big attack in Paris, and then a very big attack in 2016 in Brussels. So it felt like, the continent was under siege. The wars in the Middle East were infecting Europe itself. And lastly, you had the specter of populism and Brexit, which kind of became the same thing. And until the day of the Brexit referendum in July of 2016, no one thought it was possible. Brits can't be that crazy. Americans can't be that crazy to elect Donald Trump president. That was one of many illusions that was shattered in that period. It was fairly down then. And the press corps was fairly down too. It had shrunk in half since the 90s. That was because of, obviously, the adjustment to the internet, and what happened in the US media also happened in European media. But it was kind of a city that felt, and its elites felt a little bit kind of down on their luck. And in a funny way, I think Politico's arrival there, lots of noise around it, but it flattered them too. Like, oh, we are important enough to get this prominent media outlet to take us seriously.
And also, there was a ton of coverage globally of what was happening in Europe, in the sense that Europe was under threat.
You always have to be lucky in many things in life, but certainly with the media launch. It was very lucky that suddenly Europe was the biggest story for terrorism, for migration, for Greece. That was resolved by that summer, but still seemed, like, wow, this might turn really bad. And because of the populist rise with Viktor Orban, Brexit. So 2015, this is before the 2016 election, which ended up being very important in the US. Europe was probably a high point in terms of American interest, certainly in Europe in this century.
You mentioned earlier about the reporting staff that you brought on being from across Europe. For most or many, English was a second language. And I'm curious how that affected your coverage of Brussels. What I'm getting at here is, in the US, like, we watch American politicians, they're speaking in their native language. And if they slip up and say something, it's like, bam, you can hit them. In Brussels, sometimes, European politicians may say something second language. It probably didn't mean it quite that way. How did the language play into that? It's an English publication. English is really the language of Brussels. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about how English language, how did that kind of impact your reporting or your reporters?
Funny enough, actually, English was not the language of Brussels when I was there in the mid-90s. It really helped to speak French, and French was certainly used as much as English inside the European institutions. It was still Jacques Delors, the famous French Mandarin who ran the European Commission, kind of paved the way for a single currency. It was still a French-flavored and French-accented city, and that changed. It's even more of an English language city now since Britain left, because then it's undisputably the common language, and the French can't say, well, we're not going to speak the language of the Brits because they aren't even here anymore. Certainly English was the language, but I think what we at Politico then and what now I see, and by the way, on the media scene in Brussels now, there's lots of new kind of competitors coming up. But I think the one thing that they all have in common is that if you want to cover any world well, you have to bring people into your newsroom who, quote unquote, speak the language of that world, who understand it, who understand its sort of weirdnesses. And, Politico publishes primarily in English, I guess now in German and French. But English was a lingua franca, but it was very important to have non-Americans, non-Brits in the newsroom because it meant that you had an understanding for the story that otherwise you would not have. You had access to people that you would not have. It's a little bit of a melting pot or a quilt or whatever you want to call it, but it's still very much driven by individual nation states, and some are definitely much more important than others. And one of our best at the time scoop getters was one of my German colleagues, Florian Eder, who just had an in with the Germans in town because he was German. He was a veteran German journalist, very well connected, and he was able to get the kinds of stories that, with all due respect, I don't think an FT journalist could have gotten because they're all Brits in that office. Maybe that's not true now, but it was certainly true then.
Yeah, it does strike me as from getting sources, a sort of target-rich environment when you have 27 different countries and officials from all over.
Completely. And by the way, in Brussels, you have someone from the Maltese delegations at the same meeting as the guy from the German delegations. If you want to know what's happening in the room, maybe don't waste time in the German and actually go take out the Maltese for a beer and get them to spill the beans.
Right. There isn't quite the same kind of one team, one fight or fear of retaliation sometimes. As a former U.S. government official, if I were ever to talk to the press sort of out of turn, you're kind of looking around, making sure that you're on background or off the record.
No, completely. I mean, this is a fairly leaky town still, but that should be a leakier town than it is. I think what Politico in 2015 forced journalists there to do is to try a little harder. There are many journalists who could be working harder than they are to get original information to really break through with scoops. And it's easier done in Brussels than people realize because it seems on the outside, it's so gray and impenetrable, these reports. Oh my God, they have things like, non-paper, white paper, and they have
trilogues.
There's a test on that later on. But in fact, because there's a lot of people who know what's going on, and my colleague Tara kind of figured that out early on. She just sort of mapped out, I can work these people, triage that information with this group here. Everyone had their own angle. There were 27 angles. In fact, there were many more angles than that because you had sort of different parties as well involved, different interest groups. So it's actually, in a funny way, it's a very transparent place that the media had not done full service to making as transparent as it should have been. And I felt that there's a disservice done to the European cause, so to speak, that there was a lot of people there who saying, oh, we're here to defend the European cause, therefore we will not do critical stories on Europe. And no, if you believe in Europe at all, you do the critical stories on Europe because that's how it gets better. That's healthy. That's normal in democracy. And that was not happening enough.
One of the challenges, I think, for the European project is creating this sort of pan-European media environment where around Europe, people start to understand Brussels a bit more. Did you see that Politico's audience in Brussels was really focused on Brussels itself, wanting everyone in Brussels to read it, and ergo, because of that, important people around Europe would read it? Or was there a goal to sort of really reach a broader pan-European audience? Was the focus Brussels or all of Europe? And how would you assess things sort of came out by the end of your tenure?
There's two different things here. I think one is there were a lot of illusions that Europe had about itself and tried to sell to its electorates about what it was and was doing that I think have been shattered probably usefully over the years. Back in history, 2005, they tried to force a constitution down the throats of Europeans for the EU. The French, of all people, were the ones who really killed it by voting it down. And even as recently as this week, when Donald Trump, forced a trade deal that Europeans see as a humiliation. But the illusion there is that unless Europe delivers for its electorates, that it enables people to live better, enables growth, innovation, really concretely comes through, then it's just fake. And I think there's a lot of fakery that was going on around Europe and the European story. So I'm Polish, grew up in Poland, EU member state, spent a lot of time there, French family, so I kind of see things from different angles of Europe. No matter where you go in Europe, you will find support for the European idea, although I hate that phrase, of the European project, which is slightly better. It means that my kid can grow up in Paris and get a job. Used to be London, not true anymore. Get a job in Frankfurt, get a job in Milan, travel freely. The single currency has kept inflation down, has actually forced some discipline on some countries like Italy and Greece that did not know how to manage their economies very well and got away with it. Borderless Europe, some of the aid works, the idea of being part of a kind of competitive single whole, that works. And that actually, I think, resonates with people. What does not resonate is bullshit, and there's a lot of bullshit around sort of the European idea and the project. And the way that I think that relates to journalism is that journalists should be the bullshit meter, right? That they should spot it and call it out and really just report on what's working, what's not working, why they're doing what they're doing. By the way, this came up all the time. Like, are you for Europe or against Europe? If Europe is collapsing before our eyes, we will chronicle it. That's the journalist's job. The journalist's job is not to advocate for the European idea. It's to do in-depth reporting, to break news, to do some really great analysis, great feature stories, bring the story to life. And that is in service of the European idea. The great journalists in Brussels, whether today, 10 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, got that. And they said journalism is the craft of understanding what's going on, not falling for the spin that's inevitably coming out. People may genuinely believe it, but your job is not to fall for it, just cut through it, report, show what's really going on.
You mentioned some of the other competitors to Politico that have emerged. There's Euractiv and Euronews and a number of others. How do you assess kind of the European media environment today or the Brussels media environment? Has it matured, grown? Does it look more like Washington, a bit more competitive and cutthroat?
It's changed hugely in 10 years. And I think Politico can take some credit for that. It really kind of shook up Brussels. It challenged some of the incumbents. Euractiv and Euronews were there, and they've been forced to up their games. There's new ownership at Euractiv and at Euronews that are trying new things. One of my very close colleagues from Politico now runs Euractiv. It's a real, genuine competitor to Politico trying to be, again, and that's healthy. There's something called Context, which is a French language publication. There's some kind of interesting startups. There's a great Substack. So it's much more vibrant. The paradox for me is that if Europe used to be the Europe of the European dream, although that phrase was coined by Jeremy Rifkin, who's an American futurologist. I think on that one was probably wrong. We can't debate that, Max, if you think he was wrong or not. And the story in Europe was much more of a kind of like a grand political story. And it was actually grand in the 90s. It was enlarging Europe, settling the post-Cold War order, the single currency never done before, unprecedented, trying to stabilize Europe's peripheries, including in the Middle East. The story now is far less grand. It's much more grubby, but it's no less important. And it's really about, Europe's regulatory powers, its trade authorities. There's a lot of money on the line in what Europe decides, which I think is, there's no journalism without cash. And there is cash in Brussels now more than ever to lobby, to try and change people's minds. That helps support a lot of these media outlets in Brussels. So it's grubbier. It doesn't have the same dreamlike, again, to use that phrase, qualities that it used to. But it means that I think Brussels is important in different ways than it was in previous decades.
It sort of seems like the rose-colored glasses have been removed, seeing it a bit more clearly, and it's doing real things, and that's where the coverage seems to be really focused on.
Yeah, that's a lot of what political and policy coverage is, what's in this directive, what's in this law, who's trying to fight to stop this from happening, how is this going to affect the chemicals industry or what have you. I do think Europe is, at a very trying moment, and this has been a trend for the last 20 years, that the national capitals are taking back both practical powers, but certainly the moral authority. There's a willingness in the era of Kohl and Mitterrand that we are all together holding hands at Verdun. And then you have Jacques Delors. He's really running the show in the best interest of all Europeans and all mankind because we're somehow superior to anyone else. And this is kind of the greatest human political enterprise you can think of. Not true anymore. Party speaks to its kind of underwhelming cast of characters. If I was doing the soap opera now in Brussels, I don't think it would be as fun. I've heard from colleagues there that it's not as fun as it was 10 years ago. The main action is in the national capitals that don't really see eye to eye. You have a very weakened president in France that has not gotten along with the chancellor of Germany for many years. We had a rotating cast there. Merz is trying to establish himself. Meloni's quite strong. Stammer is an interesting character because he's outside Europe. He's trying to play both sides. He's with Europe on Ukraine. He's not with Europe on the trade stuff. So Europe's a very different place now. It doesn't seem like the best moment to think of, well, there's definitely a moment for like pan-European journalism. That, there are people in Denmark who will think they have more in common with someone in Greece than they do with someone in the US or outside Europe, that we're all kind of Europeans together. I don't hear that as much, but there is an opportunity for more of this, probably somewhat narrower journalism, some call it trade journalism. And Brussels is a very good place for that. And that's why you have all these newcomers and some of the older companies that have kind of really upped their game recently there.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me is that the difficulty in covering Europe politically and also probably from a journalistic perspective is this sort of the multi-level game of Brussels versus member states. Oftentimes I look at European member state politics. I think what we're sort of seeing in Germany is it doesn't really matter who's chancellor. It's sort of the same German approach if it's SPD or CDU. And there may be differences at the national level. There may be fights over bike lanes in Denmark. But then when they approach at the European level, it's pretty consistent. Yet the big issues that are being discussed, the US-EU trade deal, European defense, all these issues are happening at the national level, but also really play out at a Brussels level, maybe at NATO, but also at the EU. And so there's an interesting dynamic here where you kind of need to know what's happening in the national capitals. But if national capitals ignore Brussels, it's not like reading and understanding Swedish politics. That's the key to understanding Europe. The difference between Swedish parties is significant, but at a European level, they're pretty similar. And then it kind of plays out at the European stage.
Yes. And I would say it really is a very big difference if Macron is president or Marine Le Pen is president of France. And for the big countries, it's been a very big difference that you have a prime minister in Italy who seems to be both popular and there for the long run. I've never thought of an Italian prime minister lasting beyond the next season. And she's one of the more influential voices in Europe. Brussels is the stage for where a lot of this stuff plays out, whether it's because of NATO and the defense conversation or it's because it handles the trade negotiations. But I think Europe is now less than the sum of its parts. And that, I think, shows up in the weakness that you see coming out of Brussels politically. It's partly the time we're in, it's partly the personalities that are involved. And it's also the personality here in the US. There's a lot of, I think, hope in the spring that Trump would help make Europe great again by bringing it together. And you've had, the breakthroughs on defense. Maybe this will be a wake-up call. But I still fail to see a response either from Brussels or any of these national leaders really step up and say, okay, we got this report from Mario Draghi, the former Italian prime minister, head of the European Central Bank last year, that said, look, Europe's falling behind. There's an incredible chart. In 2010, the European economy, American economy, same size. Today, European economy is 2/3 the size of the American economy. Like prosperity or impoverishment has real consequences politically and in the world. This could be the moment where we look back and say, this is when Europe was forced by Trump, by his brusqueness, by his, he's breaking every norm. This is just terrible. How are they going to respond to it? I think that's going to be the real test. One of the things that we didn't see happening in the post-Cold War era, although people talked about it, was that the European decision to, one, reduce defense spending dramatically, because, okay, we can cash this in. America's always going to be here for us. Turns out now, not the best bet. We can cash it in and then put it into welfare spending. What that did is you don't realize the connection between spending on military and how innovative countries are on technology. And I think some of the reason why Europe is so behind, not just economically, but on AI, there is no European tech champion, was partly a result of that move to really stop putting money. Fine, part of it goes into buying guns, but a lot of it was going into innovation, research, really trying new things, as in this country. The second big decision was that the Europeans decided that they're going to be the regulator for the world. All these fights about the precautionary principle. Now they care about privacy. We're going to regulate the digital space, let America innovate, but we're going to set the rules for it. That also ended up dampening innovation in Europe and is one of the reasons why you have, again, the European economy being 2/3 the size of the US. Not the only one, but that was a political choice. And both these choices were either accepted by or driven by, especially with regulation, by Brussels. Trump has kind of called them out on it. Great challenge for Europe now, which is a really great story for journalists over there, is how is Europe going to react to this? Are they going to kind of stay in this fetal position as they were this week? Or will they actually kind of get up and say, okay, we're going to do something about it? Question then is who? who's going to do it for them? And that's where I don't currently see an answer.
I would add a third point to yours, also the lack of investment, the kind of attachment to austerity post-2008. You didn't see investment going into European countries. German trains now are falling apart. And it's been reversed recently in Germany. I'm a little bit more half glass full, but maybe one sort of final question, just sort of looking forward about the European media landscape. Journalism is going through a lot of things right now. Is what you're seeing sort of playing out here in the US, really tough time for a lot of local newspapers and a really challenging environment. Is that also playing out in Europe? And how do you see things sort of going forward with the European media landscape?
I think whatever happens here happens there, just a bit later and slower. Neither is actually a good thing. Austerity. The US had a pretty hard adjustment in 2009, but cleaned out its banks faster and was back on a growth path earlier. In Europe, much more risk averse, many more bailouts. That took a lot longer. I think similarly in media, Axel Springer being kind of a notable exception here. There are other notable exceptions. If you go to my home country, Poland, it's a very dynamic and forward-leaning media environment, partly because there was nothing really to preserve in Poland post-89, so people thought we're just going to do new stuff. And so I see them, I think there's a little bit probably more reactive than it should be, generally speaking, to what happens in the US and maybe on the media things. And there are some amazing things happening in Europe too that are very interesting and kind of at the national level. And as we discussed, at the pan-European level. Technology is a through line now through everything, obviously through the media, and Europeans are really smart, well-educated. They know what's going on here. People pick up on ideas that have worked here. I think you're seeing a lot of things that have worked here are being tried out there. The explosion in podcasts, explosion in kind of personality-driven journalism, explosion in B2B journalism that, if you want to make this work, you got to find ways to pay for it. The easiest way to do that is to make sure that you're doing journalism people need to have, so they're going to pay for it. So I think that's happening too in Europe. I do find myself reading more print newspapers in Europe than I do here. They're a little bit easier to find. But, in Paris, in my old neighborhood, I think the last guy who still sells Le Monde still walks around, but he's a kind of a local celebrity. You're seeing the same things playing out than here.
Well, Matt, I want to thank you so much for coming into the studio today. Thank you so much for being here on the Eurofile.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.